Well, good morning again, and welcome to the 2019 edition of the McKnight Lectures. Our theme this year is being known, shame, sexuality, and community. And we are delighted to have Dr. Thompson with us. He lives in Northern Virginia. He's married to Phyllis for 33 years, has 2 grown children, has a private practice in Northern Virginia. He loves doing this type of event where he comes and is able to speak on some of the subjects that God has blessed him to study, to learn about, part of his own story and his own life. So, Dr. Thompson, would you come and share with us now what God has put on your heart?
So welcome to Sabbath, where I'm glad to see everyone here. It's, you know, the topic of shame must be really popular. Anybody here know Brene Brown? I mean, I don't know, like, you might not know her, but you ever heard that name before? Yeah, you know that, Brene. And if you know Brene Brown's work, you know, one of the things that I wrote this book on shame, and people have asked me frequently, what do you think of Brene Brown's work? And I say, well, there are 2 things that really strike me about this. The first is that I think that we couldn't be more fortunate than to have her work that shows up at this particular time. I think that her work has been really helpful, really useful, and so I think we couldn't be more fortunate than to have that. I said, but here's the second thing. You would think that with all of the popularity of her work, you would think that the world was waking up and learning and hearing about shame for the very first time in our history. You would think that people would not have forgotten that 20, now almost 30 years ago, John Bradshaw, some of you might remember that name, John Bradshaw wrote a book called Healing the Shame That Binds You, that was an exposition on a similar topic, that sold millions of copies. It got him a PBS special that ran for years, and yet somehow, shame found a way to fade back into the woodwork. And I want to tell you that 30 years from now, someone is going to have to come along and help us learn about shame all over again for the first time. Because I want to suggest right out of the gate that it is its manner to be discovered and then hide, because that's part of how it operates. And so I want to invite us today to consider that I'm going to give you some information about it. And I think that the information, I hope it will be helpful. But I also want you to recognize that you may hear some things today that sound interesting, that may intrigue you, that may cause you to want to go home and do something about this. And I will tell you that evil will not want that to happen. Now, if we just talk about this topic from a clinical standpoint, I'm going to do 3 things here. We're going to talk about what clinical standpoint, like what does it look like. The second thing is like what does it mean for us to be involved in our story? How does shame actually show up in our story? And the third thing would be like, what do we do about that? And the first thing, if you were to look at the clinical literature just about shame, and it doesn't matter, we're not looking at it even from a biblical perspective, you would find that shame has some particular attributes. Those of you who were here yesterday have heard this already, but we're going to walk through some of those attributes. One of the first things it's important to know that when anybody here ever, do you have a memory of like in the last, let's say, month, like feel ashamed? Raise your hand. Right, so those of you who haven't, raise your hand, like you're lying. Okay, what about anybody feel something have shame in the last week? Okay. What about like in the last hour? Like while I was preaching, right? Right, so here's the thing, we all kind of get it. We all kind of get, we know what it feels like, we know the sense of it and so forth. But here's some interesting information about what we know about it as it applies to the human condition, how we actually experience it interpersonally and neurobiologically. Here's the first thing, that shame, before anything else, is a neurological event. It's an embodied event. It's something that you literally sense, image, feel in your body before it even becomes something that shapes what you think or imagine. So this kind of thing happens all the time when we hear somebody talk to us in a certain tone of voice, or we see a certain glance. So one thing it's important to know is that it operationalizes, not first in what we think about ourselves, it operationalizes first in terms of how we sense and feel things in our physicality. And so this is why when we want to talk about it, when we want to address it, when we want to correct it, it's not always very helpful for us to say, well, you just shouldn't be ashamed. Because it's not like our brain is going to listen to that and our body know how to make sense of that. Alan Shore, who's a neuropsychologist on the West Coast, talks about shame physically like this. For those of you who drive a standard transmission automobile, you know that we have an accelerator, we have a brake, and we have a clutch, right? The four of you who drive those things, right? Okay, right, we have a clutch, right. And we know that any time that the engine decelerates, we have to apply the clutch or what happens? Right, it stops, and it stops violently, right? It doesn't just like go quietly into the night. No, we've all been there. Well, not all of us, only four of us have been there because there's only four of you to drive. And so one of the things that Shore likens this metaphor to is that when we as human beings are born, we come into the world and newborns, infants, toddlers are just simply in go mode. They just want to go. Amen? Amen. Have you heard like the whole amen thing from the sermon? How many of you were there this morning? Right. Okay, you can like, okay, like, okay. So they're just in go mode until we have to stop them, and we have to apply the brake. We have to find a way to apply the brake. And toddlers are not necessarily prone to applying the brake on their own. They need help. And this is what parents are for. Parents are like braking systems at times when the toddlers just want to go. Our accelerator, our go system, resides in a part of the brain called the sympathetic drive system. Now, you might have heard of the sympathetic drive system and as something like, you know, as opposed to the parasympathetic drive, as our fight or flight mechanism. That's part of it, but that's not the only thing that it does. It's in go mode. But we have to say no to things. We have to apply the brake. And parents begin to do this. And hopefully over time, like by the time the kid might be like, say, 40 years old, he might know how to do this, right? So the brake is applied. But if the brake is applied and there's no clutch, shame is what happens. So let me give you an example. Just with the tone of voice, it's, you know, we like to talk about 7 different nonverbal cues that human beings exhibit. And of those nonverbal cues, of those 7 nonverbal cues, more and more research is pointing to the idea that the tone of voice probably is the point of the sphere of the single most influential nonverbal cue that we offer to the world, both to others and to ourselves. And so you know that when you hear that tone of voice that says something to you that you feel, even though the words are like this. Like, if anybody here married? Are you married to people that are like in the room? Okay, you know, you've heard this voice, right? The voice that says, "Are you wearing that tie?" And of course you want to say, well, with that tone of voice, yes, I am. Right, we know they're not really, that person isn't really asking a question, right? They're making a statement, and the tone of voice is what delivers that. When children hear this, it's the brake being applied without a clutch. Does that make sense? And of course, it happens in the boardroom. It happens in, you know, you go to a cocktail party, right? You go to a party and you're with 3 or 4 people and you make a statement offering something in the conversation. And you make a statement, and the other 3 people just keep going without even acknowledging your sentence. Have you ever had that happen? What do you feel? Do you enjoy that? You're like, I love being ignored. No, you don't enjoy that. And here's the thing. In that circle, someone is saying no to you. They're applying the brake. They're dismissing what you're saying. Now, we might say, look, Kurt, like, this is not like awful. It happens to people all the time. But that's part of the point. Most of how shame operationalizes itself in terms of somebody saying no without the clutch happens frequently, hundreds and hundreds of times, all the time, in very, very minor ways. And it starts when we're little, and it continues right up into adulthood. And so it's a neurophysiologic event in which we feel something. We feel the absence. And what is that clutch? So we know what this accelerator is. The accelerator is my sympathetic drive system in my brain that wants to go. I'm interested in things, curious things. I want to start things. I want to make things. The brake is I need to stop this. And my parents are doing it, and then I need to learn how to do it. But what is the clutch? And the clutch is deeply connected interpersonal relationships. So this is what we mean when we say that we can say no to a child, and if we are still attuned to the child in the process, if we are attuned to what the child is feeling and sensing, even while we say no, the child is going to be able to apply the brake, have the brake applied, and be okay. Shame doesn't take place not because no is being said. Shame doesn't take place because of the application of relationship. Does that make sense? How many of us grew up in homes where there wasn't much of a clutch? And it doesn't mean that we don't have to be perfect at this, right? Like we said yesterday, like children don't need parents who are perfect. Children need parents who are attuned and who are willing to repair the ruptures. That's what children need. And so we know then that this clutch is hugely important, and shame happens in the absence of a relationship, even when we have to say no to each other about important things. So it is first a neurological event. The second thing we know is that shame starts early and often. Children can begin to experience shame as early as 15 to 18 months of age. Long before they have language, right? All they have to do is sense it. A third thing that we know is that when shame occurs, when that shudder occurs because of the lack of a clutch, other things within the mind, our sensing, imaging, feeling, thinking, doing brains, start to literally disintegrate. Now, by disintegrate, I don't mean that they dissolve in your head. I mean that the different neural pathways that represent the functions of different things, what we sense, what we image, what we feel, what we think, and what we do, they have a hard time talking to one another. How many of us, when you've ever been really humiliated about something, have an easy time thinking in that moment? How easy is it for you to find joy in the next thing you want to do while you're kind of shackled with that? It's difficult because of how shame operates to disintegrate different functions of the mind from collectively working together, right? So it's disintegrating, it's isolating, right? I tend to feel shame. I don't want to tell you about it. I not only feel it internally, deeply, but it also means that I tend to want to not tell you things. So in the same way that my mind is being isolated within itself, I now also isolate myself from other people. What's going on inside my brain is reflected outside in my relationships. So we see that shame is not just a disintegrating force within us as individuals, it disintegrates us as communities. Not only is it disintegrating and isolating, it also tends to move us toward stasis. We have a hard time literally, physically moving. If you've seen, witnessed a dog being ashamed, right? This is why, like, it doesn't take much. Right? We can shame dogs. If dogs can be ashamed, like, anything can be ashamed, right? Cats, I don't know about them. I don't know that. I don't really know why cats are here. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, peace. Okay. But the point is, we can literally find ourselves physiologically immobile. But it also means that relationally we become immobile. Relationally, when I feel ashamed, am not going to venture out to make new connections with others. Condemnation is another hallmark of this. I told this story yesterday. So our son Nathan, who's now 26, when he was in 8th grade, he came to me and he said, "You know, Dad, this thing that you and Mom and Rachel, his older sister," he said, "the thing that you seem to have, this relationship with Jesus, like, I don't get it." He said, "I pray and it's a blank. And it's not like I disagree with the way of life, but I just don't understand. Like, I don't feel this same sense of having a relationship with God that you talk about." And I was actually quite okay with this as a father of this 8th grader, because when I was 13, I had my first major existential crisis, and it lasted and waxed and waned until I was about 30. And by the time I became a parent, I was pretty much of the mindset, like, I can't wait till I have a kid who has to wrestle with this thing, because, like, I'm going to be a parent who's heroic. I'm going to be the parent who listens. I'm going to be the parent who wants to know about it, and who, like, walks with them and talks with them and all those kinds of things that you do if you're a heroic parent. And so I wasn't worried about this when he was in 8th grade. And when he was a sophomore in high school, Jesus tagged him, came and found him in a profound way. And the next several years of his life were ones of great joy and growth, and he and I even deepened in our relationship. I don't deserve my life, let alone to have a life in which I can have this kind of a relationship with Jesus, with each of my children. And then he gets to his sophomore year in college, and he runs into a buzzsaw in college. And he comes home at Christmas and he says, Dad, I'm not sure I believe any of this stuff anymore. Now, of course, there was a part of me that was like, oh, this is great, because this is where superhero Kurt Thompson, the father, gets to step up, right? This is just going to be awesome. Until we actually started to have the conversation. And as I said yesterday, you know, sometimes you have those times when you're speaking, and as the words come out of your mouth, you know that they need to stop, but the more you notice that they need to stop, the more they come out of your mouth. And they come out faster and stronger and harder, and you can't stop yourself. And that's what was happening. And I, in effect, over the course of about a 2 or 3 hour conversation with my son, basically said to him, if you're not going to believe in Jesus, I think you're an idiot. Now, it's probably, it turned out that it was probably 48 of the most painful hours of my life that followed. Because I saw the crestfallen facial expression. I saw the withdrawing. I felt it. I heard it. I sensed it. And I couldn't stop the train that was running away. I summarily shamed him for what in my mind was ostensibly my worry that he wasn't believing the right things. 2 days later, he left for his spring semester at college. And for 2 weeks, I was a wreck. And we got to 2 weeks later, and we finally were able to get on the phone together. And all I could say was that I'm sorry, and I don't even know how to say more than that. And I don't want this, I can't live like this. Because I realized that, in fact, it's not that I thought you were an idiot. It's that I thought that you thought I was an idiot. Because he's a pretty smart guy. And all my old demons from my first 3 decades of life got evoked in this conversation and landed on him. And you see, the issue was not that I was afraid that my son was leaving Jesus. The issue was that I was afraid that my son was leaving me. And I had no way to stop that train. So we talked and continued to talk. And about every 2 weeks we would talk. He'd come home for spring break. We'd talk. And every time we would talk, I would say, are we okay? Because I'm really worried that we're not. See, this is another thing that shame does. Shame has lots of residue. It sticks around. You can do something, feel guilty about it, get forgiveness, and you still feel awful about it. And when you still feel awful about it, that's not guilt, that's shame lurking around. Because it literally lodges in your neural memory networks that are lodged in your body, right? It sticks around. And so about every 2 to 6 weeks, I would ask him, are we okay? And he would say, yes, we're really good. He's really serious. We're really good. And then that fall, he was going off to his semester abroad, and I said, are we okay? And he said, we're okay. But if you ask me one more time if we're okay, we're not going to be okay. And I said, okay. Condemnation, like this, right? Condemnation is another one of shame's cognitive hallmarks, and it begins within us. And when we don't know what to do with that, we just extend it to other people around us. And this is exactly what I was doing with my son. Now, thanks be to God, within the course of a number of years, he's made a turn and is as committed to Jesus as ever, despite his father being heroic. Last couple of things that we would say about shame and its features are that in addition to condemnation, it's a harbinger for abandonment, right? It's a signal One of the questions that came up yesterday was like, is there any such thing as good shame? Shame that's helpful for us? And I would say, yeah, it's helpful for us to know that shame is primarily a signal that indicates that abandonment is on the way if we don't do something different than what we're doing currently, right? It's a signal to us. It was a signal in the Garden of Eden, as we'll hear about in just a moment. So there is this sense in which abandonment, this sense that I'm going to be left, and this feeling of shame is a harbinger of that. It's telling us that. The question is, how do we then respond to it? Shame becomes so much a part of who we are that it's often just automatic. We don't even know that it's happening. We don't even know that it's happening. And so I just sense it, feel it, image it. I don't even have to think it. But one of the things that it does is that it helps us learn how to tell stories. And this is important for us because one of the things that it's important to know, shame isn't just this thing that happens to us. It is a thing that happens within the context of our story, right? I was actually, without saying it explicitly, I was telling a story to my son. I was telling a story that indicated that, like, I'm afraid that you're leaving, and if you don't believe the way I believe that I'm going to have a separation with you, I need to stop this. And in so doing, I basically communicate to him that he's an idiot. And we do this all the time. In what ways is shame actually showing up in the way you tell your story? So, for example, if I grow up in a house where I'm working really hard, and my dad, every time I bring up the test paper to my dad with my 90% on it, and Dad says, "That's great, where's the other 10%? Right? One of the things I begin to learn, I feel bad, but what I have to do to regulate this is that I have to tell a story about this. And the story that I tell by the time I'm 18 is I need to work harder in order to please my dad. That's the story that is true. My dad is not able to be pleased. I have to work hard enough. I'm only 90%. I'm not 100%. Are you with me? This is the story that I tell. This is the story that literally becomes neurally embedded in my brain circuits. This is what I become. But the reality is that what I'm experiencing has got nothing to do with that. The reality is that I'm experiencing this shame because my dad doesn't have his stuff together. The truth is, I feel shame not because I'm not working hard enough as a son. The truth is, I feel shame because my dad doesn't have his stuff together as a father. But that's not the story that I tell. I tell a very different story, and the story is reinforced over and over and over again. And then I grow up and have friends, and I get married. Maybe I get married to a person who is really I want to please that person, and the person asks me to do things, but I'm it's never going to be enough, and I've already have her in the story like this. Are you with me? So this is the second thing. You've heard some things about how shame works, but here's the most important thing. Shame works in the context of our story, and in the biblical narrative, it all begins with this, right? We look at the first chapter of Genesis. We look at the first chapter of Genesis, and everything about Genesis is just joy, 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 joy. Day one, it was good. Day two, it was good. We make, and it's great. Day three, day four, day five, we make the Ohio State Buckeyes. It's super great, right? Okay, right. So this is a God of joy. And then we get to the second chapter, and at the very end, at the end of this creation narrative, and we hear these words, "And the man and the woman were naked, and they were unashamed." Why do the Hebrew storytellers use that word, shame? They could have used any number of different words, but they insert that word, possibly because they're getting us ready for the next part of the story. But I want to suggest this, that shame, I want to say this, evil is the second smartest force on the planet. And it knows some things about how we've been made. And it knows that we have been made in such a way that the most beautiful, most durable, most wonderful things that we will ever create together as co-creators with God, as stewards of the creation, the most wonderful, beautiful things that we will ever make must be made in the presence of nakedness. And by nakedness, the writers of that text aren't just even primarily referring to their physical state. They're referring to the state of vulnerability of their souls. We make the most beautiful things in states of vulnerability. We make the most beautiful things when I can reveal to you not just my strengths, but my weaknesses. Because when I'm weak, when I bring to the table the things about me that are not great, you bring to the table the things that can compensate for that. You bring to the table the things that can help me in my weakness. I bring to the table the things that can help you in your weakness. When we are vulnerable, God steps in and all kinds of joy breaks out. Amen? Okay. And evil's aware of this. They were naked and unashamed. They were vulnerable, and shame was not part of the conversation. This is the story. And then into the story, in the very next thing that we read. Now the serpent was the craftiest of all of the creatures that the Lord God had placed in the garden. The craftiest. It is Satan's intention not just to fool us, but to devour us, as Lewis would talk about. And this is the story in which we leave. You leave here with a bullseye on your chest. Most of us, we don't believe that. And I will tell you that evil will use shame primarily not just to make you feel bad. It will use shame as a way to keep you from creating a world of goodness and beauty and joy that God wants to co-create with us. The gospel is about God saying that with the resurrection of Jesus, God is in the business of renewing all things. It's our job to decide if we're going to step into that with belief, beginning with us. Evil knows this, and it knows its days are numbered. And so it's very crafty. And how does it begin? It starts with a question. Is it true? This is the conversation goes. Is it true that if you eat of the fruit, you won't die? That you'll die? Is it true? That's not true, he tells me. And I want to just ask this. Right? I read about this in the book. I want to posit this in our minds. I want to posit the notion that shame actually shows up in the garden long before any fruit gets eaten. Think about this for a second. So I have a patient who's now in their 60s, who when they were 19 years of age and they were in college, her father called her on the phone, and her father was her hero. Her father had been this deeply committed believer, this person who had been with her and her family and so forth. Her father was heroic, like really heroic, not like my version, right? Really heroic. And he calls her while she's at college because she's the last one out, and he says to her, I just want to let you know that I'm leaving your mother and I'm moving to Seattle, where I have another family. But I also want you to know that it's not your fault. You've got nothing to do with this. Now, here's the thing. It would be impossible for her to believe that it was not her fault. Because if Dad can choose to go somewhere else, and like this story, like you can't make this stuff up, like humans, unbelievable, right? You can't make this up. If Dad can make a choice to go somewhere else, he can make a choice to stay here. And if it's not me, then who is it? Just so you know, this is what children will do all the time. And it doesn't matter if they're 2 or they're 42. We children, when parents do things, we will assume it's our fault until or unless somebody else tells us otherwise. And when the serpent starts to talk to the woman, I want to suggest if you read the text, you'll see that the serpent, interestingly enough, does not say, hey, let's go have a conversation with God. No. Or let's have a, like, what does your husband think? Adam, you haven't said much. You're kind of like a man. You haven't said very much. I want you to contribute to the conversation, right? He doesn't invite any other voices into this. So the first thing that happens is evil wants to isolate the woman in the conversation. Shame finds itself active in the privacy of our own minds more than anywhere else. Most of our shame that we experience is not through large traumatic events. All of that happens, and it has happened to many people in this room. But I will guarantee you that most of where shame is active is in the death of 1,000 cuts that's taking place in the privacy of our own minds, day after day after day, moment after moment. I should have done this, I should have done that, I'm not enough for this, I'm not enough for that, I should have been smarter, I should have, you know what I mean. And it all begins with the servant saying to her, God doesn't want you to become like him. Just like the father essentially was saying to my patient, I don't really want you to be with me, near me. Now, he's not saying that directly, but this is the message that she takes in, because what other message is there but this? Does that make sense? And so I would suggest that suddenly the fruit starts to look pretty good as a way for me to cope with what it is that I'm already feeling in the middle of this conversation. How many of us find ourselves in the middle of stories in which we feel isolated, and in which, in the privacy of our mind, I'm hearing in some way, shape, or form, you're not enough, you're not enough, you're not enough. Your father, your mother, whoever it is, doesn't really want you being in their life. You're not enough for anyone here, let alone for God. We can't talk about shame with talking about our stories. Now, you know, I know next week you're going to be talking about sexuality, right? You know, one of the things that you wonder things like, why couldn't God, why couldn't sex have been so much more like easy, right? Like, why couldn't sex have been like, you just come like shake hands? Although that would be weird, because then people would be pregnant all over the place, right? It would, I mean, okay, sorry, Pastor. Okay, right. But you know what I mean? Like, we could do something like we would just bump elbows, or we would do, you know, Steve Gutenberg in Cocoon, right? You touch the hand, and like all these kinds of things happen. No. For the most beautiful thing that humans are ever involved in creating to happen, it happens with the part of our physicality that is the most fragile, that is the most vulnerable, that requires the greatest care, that requires great containment. And it is the part that evil has so much access at reminding us that we just simply aren't enough. Are you with me? Which is why it's so important for us to be clear about who we are and what that means for us. Sex is a really big deal, but in many respects, it's pointing to an even bigger deal. That God really, really does desire to have with us a vulnerable, creative relationship. And he doesn't want shame to be in that conversation. And this is why we say that when people are ashamed, it's really difficult for them to seek help, because the very act of turning towards someone else for help when you feel ashamed only activates the strength of that feeling itself, and that's why I don't want to do it. Which is why the whole notion of Emmanuel makes complete sense. Like, God has to come find us because we can't find him. What do we do about it? So, we've got just a few minutes, and I'm going to walk through this pretty quickly. But I want to encourage us to know that what I'm going to walk through is something that is available, but it also takes hard work. And we turn to the 12th chapter of Hebrews, the first 2 verses, and we're just going to walk through this as a model for what we do, not just about healing shame, but transforming our story. And it goes like this. Therefore, since you have before us such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off the sin that so easily entangles, or in one translation, distracts us, and run the race with perseverance that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and now sits at the right hand of God. So we're going to walk through it really quickly. Therefore, since we have before us such a great cloud of witnesses, the writer of the text is talking about those named in chapter 11 that just preceded it. Here's my question for you. Who are the people who are bearing witness to your life? And by this, I don't mean the people who are just in the biblical narrative. I mean, like, who are the flesh and blood people with whom you are going to vulnerably reveal your life so that there's nothing about you that is not known by them. This is what the gospel calls for. We do not have relationships with God or with each other. If we're practicing for heaven, we have to practice for a state of affairs in which we will be known fully. I mean, this is what Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 13. So who are those people going to be? And you're like, holy cow. Yeah, people who will know when the last time it was that you gossiped about the pastor. That would be you, Mike. People who would know the last time that you looked at pornography. People would know the last time that you were harsh with your friends. People would know there's nothing that they don't know. Who would those people be? Since we have, therefore, such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off the sin that so easily entangles or distracts us. It's important to know that I really do think that all sin begins with distraction. That's what was happening in the Garden of Eden. All sin begins with distraction. My attention is drawn to something else and away from what it is that I really want my attention to be focused on. And therein lies the question of restraint. We, as a culture, are practicing restraint less and less and less and less. Our technology is wiring us to practice not being able to demonstrate restraint. I just want to let you know that. It doesn't mean that our technology is bad, but it means that we are being co-opted and we are like agreeing with it. We are cooperating with it in such a way that it becomes increasingly difficult for us to delay gratification. And so when it comes to putting boxes around, putting borders around, putting boundaries around things that we need to say no to, it's really difficult. And if we are going to be distracted by our phones, it'll be easy to be distracted by anything. What are the things to which you need to say no to? And who are going to be the people in that cloud of witnesses that are going to help you do that? It's really important. But it's important to know that I need to be able to name what those things are, what my sin is. I need to be able to name it in such a way that when that cloud of witnesses hears it, they're not going to say, gosh, like, you're like, what's wrong with you? You're such a sinner. Right? No, I need to have someone say, like, this is really difficult. What are we together going to do to help you do this? Let us throw off the sin that so easily entangles and distracts us. Let us say no to that and instead turn our attention, turn our eyes, turn our gaze, focus our attention, fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. I want to suggest this. I don't know how many of you practice this, but it's a really good idea for us to literally, on a regular daily basis, practice imagining being in the presence of a 33-year-old Jewish dude, maybe in blue jeans and a t-shirt, who's looking at you, telling you that he can't believe he gets the privilege to be your older brother. How many of us, what would it be like for us? How many of us have had those moments of where we've done things, felt things, said things? We know who we are. We know the things about ourselves that we hate the most. What would it be like for us in those moments in which at the moment that we've done the most humiliating thing, we feel the touch of somebody's hand on our shoulder and we turn and we see a 33-year-old Palestinian guy say, like, I can't wait to see what we are going to do within the next 5 minutes. This is what Jesus does. He does not wait for us to clean our act up. He comes to find us even in this space. And when we fix our eyes on him, we see someone who's already been looking at us for a long time. But the only way I'm going to see those eyes is if I'm seeing them also in the eyes of the ones that I'm meeting with who are my cloud of witnesses. Those become Jesus' eyes for me. And you become that for others. The author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him, this joy that he has of being in our presence. This is the other thing. Most of us don't really believe that God is as like unbelievably joyful about who we are as he actually is. So here's a question. Like, so if you were to go home, I don't know, does anybody here have your best, does anybody here have their best friend in the room who's not their spouse? Who's not their spouse? Some of you do. You have your best friend. Okay, imagine this. You go home from church, And you get into your kitchen, and you walk into your kitchen. Nobody's supposed to be in your house. You walk into your kitchen, and not just one, but your 3 best friends in the world are in your kitchen. And you're like, holy crap, what are you people doing here, right? And you because you're going to want to know who died, right? This is the first thing you're going to want to know, right? And they'll say, what if they said, like, man, we were just thinking about you all this last week, and one of us we called the other, and we just decided, like, we're going to show up. What would that be like? I know it would be weird, right? But, like, can you imagine what it's like to be walking through life with the Holy Trinity saying to those around you, I got to tell you about my friend Mike. Like, it's a little uncomfortable at first, right? Because we can't really believe that God is this enamored with us. But then at some point you're like, I'm kind of liking this. I'm Mike the pastor, right? It's like I'm enjoying, because we have so few experiences of people being that joyful about our being in the world. God cannot believe his good fortune that he gets to be our God. The joy set before him, because of that, he endures the cross. Can I suggest, this work is going to require endurance. This work is going to require work. This work is going to require hard things. This work is going to require times when you're going to have to say no to things you don't want to say no to. This work is going to require times in which you're going to have to practice paying attention to a narrative of love, when it's going to be much easier for you to practice paying attention to a narrative of shame. And in so doing, he doesn't just endure the cross, but he despises its shame. He scorns its shame. And so this is one of the things that we tell people. We really, we do this with our patients, we do this with our friends. Like, we really think that we need to go find shame. Now, this is the thing about shame. Nobody really wants to go find it. Nobody really wants to collectively go make a list of all the things that I feel ashamed about. But here's what we do. We invite people to make a shame inventory, to do this on a regular basis. You get a 3x5 card out or some other version, and every time that you sense, image, feel, think, or behave in some kind of shameful way, I want you to make note of it. I had a guy come to me once after he'd done this, and he said, like, you know, by 10 o'clock one morning, I'd filled out 2 cards, front and back, and he's like, I'm just kind of tired of, like, seeing, like, how much shame is filling my mind. Here's the point. We keep our friends close and we keep our enemies closer, right? We want to know where shame lurks in order for us to identify it and then turn our attention away from it. I want to go find it. Look, the gospel is all about God coming to confront evil on God's terms. Are you with me? And if this is going to happen in our lives, it's going to require that we do the same, that we become those spaces where people can confront their own shame without having shame have the last word. And I'll end with this, that at the end of the day, what we're really looking for, what we're really hoping for, is that, you know, Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 3, the 3rd verse, he says this, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God." You're in God. This notion that we read about in Hebrews, that Jesus is now at God's right hand. Jesus is next to his dad, and his dad and Jesus are talking all the time. But the thing is, like, you're right there with him. Like, Jesus couldn't be more pleased than to welcome you into that space, because he can't believe how thrilled he is that you're on the planet. And it is in paying attention to this overwhelming sense of how deeply loved we are that we not only are able to address shame effectively, but we are also able in community to do the work of mercy and justice, right? Because like we say, like, joy always shows up in the form of justice. It always shows up in the form of justice. And where there is no justice, there's not going to be enough joy. And so this work of combating shame is commensurate with combating racism and sexism and all the other isms that we have. But it also means that we are co-laboring with Christ to realize the kingdom of God that is here and is surely coming. You've been a very kind audience. It is 10:46 by my watch. Time for me to stop. Thank you very much. Have a blessed Sunday.